everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thank you for joining us for our special coverage of the 2020 Democratic National Convention. The fourth and final night wrapped up Thursday evening with Joe Biden officially accepting the party's nomination for president. He spoke in Wilmington, Delaware. During his speech, Biden laid out his vision for the future of the country. He discussed policy plans to address top issues and called on the U.S. to, quote, overcome this season of darkness. The night also included moments from many of his former rivals who joined in to discuss why they're endorsing him now. That led to this roundtable, which featured former candidates such as Senator Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Amy Klobuchar. They recalled their time on the campaign trail and personal stories of working with Biden over the years. We also heard from politicians who had been on the list of potential running mates, like Atlanta's Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms and Illinois Senator Tammy Duckworth. The Iraq War veteran discussed her time in the military and sharply rebuked President Trump for both his foreign and domestic policies. We have some of the key moments you may have missed, starting with the moment Joe Biden officially accepted the nomination.
Here and now, I give you my word. If you entrust me with the presidency, I will draw on the best of us, not the worst. I will be an ally of the light, not the darkness. It's time for us, for we the people, to come together. I'm a proud Democrat, and I'll be proud to carry the banner of our party into the general election. So it's with great honor and humility I accept this nomination for President of the United States of America.
Trump says we should vote for him because he's a great businessman? Really? Donald says we should vote for him because the economy was great before the virus? Huh? So when Trump says he wants to make America great again, he's making a pretty good case for Joe Biden.
As president, Joe Biden would never let tyrants manipulate him like a puppet. He would never pervert our military to stroke his own ego. He would never turn his back on our troops or threaten them against Americans peacefully exercising their constitutional rights. Joe Biden would stand up for what's right, stand tall for our troops, and stand strong against our enemies. Because unlike Trump, Joe Biden has common decency. He has common sense.
You see, there's another part of my story. The part where I ran for office, the part where I served in Congress, the part where I worked with Joe Biden and Barack Obama to make sure kids and grandkids, if they're dependents, can stay on their parents' health insurance until they're 26. We got that done. And yes, it was a big effing deal. That's the America I know. That's the America I love. And that's the America we will be with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the White House.
We've cried out for justice. We have gathered in our streets to demand change. And now we must pass on the gift John Lewis sacrificed to give us. We must register and we must vote. In his parting essay written to us, Congressman Lewis expressed his pride in the activism that has swept our country. And he reminded us that if we fail to exercise our right to vote, we can lose it.
Joe Biden is right. This is a contest for the soul of the nation. And to me, that contest is not between good Americans and evil Americans. It's the struggle to call out what is good in every American.
That's the American dream. Together we work, together we rise. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris know the dignity of all working Americans. They know the urgency and the demand of our dream.
Let's bring in Ed Keefe, Caitlin Huey-Burns, Lynda Tran, and Leslie Sanchez. Ed is a CBS News political correspondent. Caitlin is our CBSN political reporter. Lynda is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. And Leslie is a CBS News political analyst. Welcome to you all. I want to start, as we always do, but especially since this is the last night of the convention, with some thoughts, starting with you, Ed. That finale was unlike anything we saw before. First of all, no balloon drop, but fireworks instead, basically right where you're standing.
Right. And, you know, Elaine, as the cars drive away from the parking lot and the smooth jazz plays, I just keep thinking to myself, this isn't quite what we expected this year. Smooth jazz in a Wilmington, Delaware parking lot at about 32 after the hour. It's a little random, but that is what we've been handed. And if you measure Joe Biden's speech in terms of car honks tonight, because that's how people out here were reacting to it, probably some of the strongest lines were for what he had to say about his running mate, Kamala Harris, about his own wife, Dr. Jill Biden, and about the daughter of George Floyd. And the whole argument that perhaps the country is turning a corner when it comes to its long troubled history with racism. So a really interesting speech by him. Perhaps he was helped by the fact that he was able to deliver essentially a magnified version of what he's been doing for the last 5 months, speaking directly to Americans by camera, usually through teleprompter, but in a way tonight that appeared to be far more presidential and different than what the country has seen from its president over the last 4 years. You know, and mixing Irish poetry, one thing that we know he likes a lot, with a little bit of specificity in terms of taxes and the future of Social Security, and also talking broadly about the need to come out of this, as he called it, chapter of American darkness. So an interesting end to an incredible week. Incredible, if only because it was so incredibly different than what we've seen before. And I've marveled at it all week and again tonight. Just sweet irony for him that he gets to do this in his hometown unexpectedly, but you know, gets that. Apparently, actually, our colleague Bo Erickson, who I know we talked to a lot about the Biden campaign, was down in a pool closer to where he was, back by those flags. And right as the fireworks ended, he ripped off his mask and he looked at the reporters and he just shouted, "Welcome to Wilmington." So again, just a completely different setting for what this all became, but a very strong argument from him tonight as to why he believes he should be president.
Yeah, not at all what we expected, though, indeed. Caitlin, you are there on the ground as well, not far from where Ed is standing. What are your takeaways? You're someone who actually sat down with Joe Biden earlier this year before the pandemic, when reporters were actually able to sit down and conduct these kinds of face-to-face interviews. What stood out to you from the convention tonight?
Hi, Elaine. Yes, I'm on the other side of the building from where Ed is, but right beneath the fireworks. And I can safely say that fireworks are better than the balloon drop, having been to a few of those conventional conventions. So fireworks for the future, I'm all for it. You know, what's really interesting, and you mentioned that we sat down with Biden in March, the night before Super Tuesday, where he would go on to sweep several states and would be kind of on his way to winning the nomination. A week after that, we were all sent home from the campaign trail. The campaign trail ceased to exist that following week as we knew it. And for the past 4 or 5 months, the Biden campaign has been operating mostly online. So unless you have been an active Democratic voter, eager to hear from what Biden has to say and tuning into those virtual events, you haven't really seen a lot of Joe Biden on the campaign trail because there hasn't been a campaign trail. And so this was a night that he had to make his case straight to voters, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and those who are deciding whether to vote at all. And we've also been talking about, you know, whether this new kind of convention that we're in, this virtual convention, what would be missing from it? The crowds, the atmosphere, the celebratory nature. But I think this kind of environment tonight really worked well for Biden because he was talking about these themes that we've been hearing and talking about all week, these themes of grief and hopelessness. Not exactly celebratory themes, but again, we're not in a celebratory environment with a pandemic going on and an economic crisis on top of it. And so I think this was, you know, having seen Biden on the campaign trail many, many times, talked to him, as Ed has as well, seen many, many speeches, I think this was the most effective speech he has given because it met this unique moment that we're in. And the line that really stood out to me was when he said, while I'll be a Democratic candidate, I'll be an American president. And I think what we saw was not designed not to be a partisan speech, although it included several swipes at the current president who he is running against. It was really designed to kind of show this contrast of what he believes his presidential leadership would look like compared to the current occupant.
You know, thank you, Caitlin. Lynda, I was just going to ask you about that very point that Caitlin raises. I'd have to go back and look at the text, but I don't know that he actually said President Trump's name, just refer to him as our current president, because there seemed to be this sort of case being made more broadly about Joe Biden as the sort of unifier in chief at a time of great division and pain in our country. What stood out to you as you listened to Joe Biden tonight?
Well, you know, Elaine, that's what we in the business call a great closing argument. And when you think about Joe Biden and his storied career over more than 4 decades of public service, it wasn't as if he needed to be introduced to this nation. People watching back at home, partisans like me, needed to be motivated and inspired and loved being reminded of the decency that he has exhibited over all of these years of dedicating his life to leading and serving in this country. And when he gave his speech tonight, honestly, the stakes were as high as they've ever been in his entire professional life. And it could have gone a different way, but he delivered the best speech of his life at the best possible time for him. He didn't need to say Donald Trump's name. You know, that was the case that was made all week long. And what we saw on display there was his ability to connect to people. You heard some of the riffs sounded a lot like a man of faith who had, you know, spent his time in Catholic school when he talked about light over dark, hope over fear. Those kinds of contrasts, I think, were very impactful and spoke to many of us back at home who have been worried and anxious during this time. And this entire week, you know, we have to remember we started the week wondering if this most unconventional of conventions was going to be pulled off, and it was seamless. You know, the connection and the ability to draw people in from the briefer remarks to the polished productions of the videos on issues and hearing from all these different voices was incredibly impactful. And I think, you know, Caitlin's point about how this might change the way that people think about conventions, I think is super valid. And I would not be surprised if we end up in a future cycle with some combination of the things that we experienced this week, even if we're able to be back in person.
You know, Leslie, it's interesting Lynda brings up this notion of faith, and I want to ask you about that because at one point we saw a very, what seemed to me, direct appeal to people of faith, to religious voters, in a way that I don't know we've necessarily seen quite in the same way. Did you notice that as well? And in addition to that, what stood out to you from what we heard from Joe Biden tonight?
On the aspect of faith, Elaine, I think it's very interesting that you picked that piece. One thing that it's very clear is it's very authentic to Joe Biden, his life, his experience, the history of his family, the way he was raised. And you can't separate that DNA from the man that he is. And that reflects a lot of the comments and the description of his character. He is a decent man. He is a prayerful man. He is somebody that can reach across the aisle, has empathy for others, understands that compassion. All of those are very strong characteristics in building bridges and bringing people together. And on both sides of the aisle, people have talked about that. There's no doubt, and it's really hard to criticize, I'm sure the president will, on character. The distinctions are going to be on policy, because right now it's very broad, and he can say, I have a plan here and there. If you look even back at the previous administration, when he was with President Obama, there's a lot to pick apart with respect to executing on those visions, and were they actually led by Biden? So on that aspect, I think there's going to be a lot illuminated in the days and weeks to come. But it was a very strong and effective way for him to say who he is. And that energy, you know, I think it does meet the moment, especially since he's been overshadowed in many ways by his vice presidential pick and certainly by Obama.
I want to go ahead and play a little bit of sound for people who may have missed it. Control room, it's SOT 11 here. We heard Vice President Biden, now the candidate Biden, make this very direct rebuke of President Trump's handling of the pandemic. So let's go ahead and play that, and then I want to get your thoughts, Ed, on the other side.
Our current president has failed in his most basic duty to the nation. He's failed to protect us. He's failed to protect America. And my fellow Americans, that is unforgivable. As president, I'll make you a promise. I'll protect America. I will defend us from every attack, seen and unseen, always, without exception, every time.
So, Ed, I'm wondering what you heard tonight with respect to a more specific affirmative case with respect to policy. That's what Leslie mentioned a moment ago. In making the argument to the American people, did we hear any more details about what his plans would be on issues if he's elected president?
Well, yeah, a few things. Talked about how he doesn't want to muzzle experts, that they'll sort of re-invite them into the conversation about what to do about this pandemic. Suggested, though he didn't say it, that he would make more aggressive use of the Defense Production Act to ensure that medical equipment was made here in the United States so that we didn't have to rely on other countries like China for the equipment and the supplies that we need. Reinforced, as he first said last week, that there should be a national mask mandate, not because it's an inconvenience, but it's patriotic. We had been told earlier today that this wouldn't become a wonky policy speech, but that there would be some general sense of what he would do. Well, the only thing really on the minds of so many Americans right now is, what are you going to do about the pandemic? So while he did touch on some other economic matters quickly, I think he understood, as he has understood most of this summer, that the only thing that matters right now is, how do you end this pandemic and how do you get the economy back in the shape it was in before this all began about 6 months ago? And so he's just continuing to answer the central question. There was a point at which, you asked Democrats over the last 18 months, is this all going to be about Donald Trump? No, we're going to talk about other things. And they did. But it has come back to that this is about, for them, getting rid of Donald Trump, getting him out of office, and moving the country forward. He did it tonight. It'll be fascinating. All I think about when I watch these kinds of speeches is, how's it going to be read in 30 to 50 years? And it'll be fascinating to look back and to see the explicit mentions of what's gone on in the streets of America this past summer in terms of race and policing, and those differences that have just come to the surface in such a dramatic way and justifiable way. And then this pandemic, and the fact that it's completely upended society, and what he said at the beginning about American anger, or the darkness, and how it's time to come out of that. If you're somebody who was looking for a little bit of optimism, you probably got it tonight. And to Leslie and Lynda, because you guys do this for a living, and you've coached people who are running for office on this, is it me, or did this sort of feel like a throwback, and that there were probably a lot of people who saw the visual tonight of him doing this direct-to-camera speech in a somewhat presidential way and thought to themselves, oh, this is what it used to be like. This is how presidents used to speak to us, with lofty rhetoric, with some specifics. Well, I'm being serious, that there was probably something that clicked for some people tonight, in that the television presentation looked presidential.
Yeah, and it's so funny you say that, because it brings to mind the statesman, right, which is somebody that traditionally the Democratic nominee, have a long line of these wonderful statesmen who come in and present this larger, a very eloquent vision, and we have missed that in many cases, and it reinserted that optic back into this conversation and this contest, and it's going to be interesting how that falls. But for some, it's a bit of nostalgia.
Yeah,
Lynda, I'm curious to get your take as well. Visual. Yeah, because it was so different to watch it in this way, Lynda.
Absolutely. But there's certain things that we would have expected to see even if we were in the convention center with him in the traditional kind of convention. And, the flags, the bunting, that classic visual staging of the presidential remarks was certainly something that we saw on display there. But the piece that I think is most riveting to us, the reason it stands out is, as Ed said, it's a throwback, but because we have been talking about for more than 4 years at this point, if you take into account the last cycle, when and if Donald Trump was ever going to be presidential, quote unquote presidential. And tonight we were reminded that actually Americans used to like to hear their presidents with their soaring rhetoric, setting a vision for what kind of country we can be, and talking about hopeful, big, strident changes that could benefit our communities back at home, rather than the sound bites and the tweets and the hurling of insults that we've just come to expect from the White House these days.
All right, one last question. Caitlin, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, usually campaigns are all about hypotheticals, and we've talked about this before. You'd be asked, what would you do if there was a global pandemic? What would you do if there was an economic crisis? What would you do if this? What would you do if that? And this is a time that we're seeing a real life test. We're in a pandemic. We're in a recession. These are real issues that a president has to deal with. And Biden and Harris are kind of getting a real-time test for it. And a reminder that as we've been talking, the election is in November. Well, early voting in some states starts in September. So we're actually not too far away.
Right. It is really just around the corner when you think about it. But it was remarkable to watch, remarkable to anchor coverage in a work-from-home situation. Never done that before for a convention. But it'll be really interesting to see for people at home who maybe have been there in the hall, what they think about this experience, watching in this way, because given our times where people do have so much uncertainty, perhaps the way that we receive information and this sort of direct-to-camera approach might resonate quite a bit differently than conventions past. All right, Ed O'Keefe, Caitlin Huey-Burns, Lynda Tran, Leslie Sanchez. It's been a long but fascinating week. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.
One more to go.
Yeah, that's right. All right.